so I'm Dr. Hasina Kajee. I'm an integrative specialist physician. My background is that I specialized in medicine and then ran the high care unit attached to the emergency department. I'm a medical director of the Noakes Foundation, and I run a private practice managing patients on a low carbohydrate diet.
I'm Joan Ifland. I'm the editor and lead author of the textbook, Processed Food Addiction. I run online support systems for food addicts, education for practitioners, and I love speaking.
Hi, I'm Jackie Eberstein, which all of you know since I just spoke. I'm a registered nurse. I've done low carb since 1974. I learned it with Dr. Atkins for 30 years. I also have worked with Theo Clinics, which no longer exists, and I work a lot with Dr. Westman. We have some projects that we do together, and we're lucky enough to have a project in China. I'll be going to China in September. And so, you know, it's wonderful for me, because I have probably a different perspective than any of you have ever had, to see how it's spreading and the different countries it's spreading to. And I think, given what Nina said about the guidelines, we're probably going to be stuck with the same old for 6 years. It's up to us to start to try to do a lot more, I think, a grassroots movement to keep this going, because we know it's safe, we know it's effective, we know it works. And so I'm just really happy to be here again. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Maria Emmerich. I'm an author. I'm an international best-selling author of 12 cookbooks and 2 nutritional guidebooks. I've had the great opportunity to speak and spread the word in Russia, Spain, Paris, and a few other places, so it is spreading, which is really cool. But most of the time I spend my days consulting clients. I had 2 today, and that's what I do.
Great, thank you. Well, welcome. And I want to start with a question for you, Hasina Kajee, which is you have particularly focused or interested in stress and its effect on hormones, and especially how this affects women through their menstrual process, maybe through menopause. So I would love for you to talk about that. Not that women ever get stressed out, but I just want to say, and I think you have a slide for this.
Please. So I've got a slide. It's not great quality, but it's something that very few people talk about. So if you look way at the top, second line, it says cholesterol.
I can see it here too.
Oh, I can see it here, yes. So if you look at the top, so that's the cholesterol that everyone's trying to reduce. But if you follow, and Dr. Ken Berry and I happened to talk about this earlier today, and what we don't realize is that that cholesterol gives rise to something that we call the mother hormone, pregnenolone. And the root that I would like to cover and highlight is something called pregnenolone steal. Now, stress is something that's good for us. When the saber-toothed tiger ran behind us, we needed that adrenaline to rise, we needed the high blood pressure, we needed more oxygen, we needed to see further, and we needed to get away from the tiger. But chronic stress is the problem. Chronic stress is the thing that causes disease. And what happens if you follow through, I don't have a pointer, but if you just follow through the lines, you'll see that pregnenolone gives rise to a few different hormones. So there's aldosterone way on the left, and then there's cortisone, then there's estrogen, so estrone, basically estrogen, so testosterone and then estrogen. And so what happens when you have a situation of chronic stress is that your body is in flight or fight. Because if you've got a saber-toothed tiger running after you, you don't want to be pregnant. It's going to slow you down. So it's a survival instinct. And so what's happening is that your hypothalamus is asking on a continuous basis, am I safe? oh no, my mother-in-law is about to come through the door, I hate her. No, I'm not safe. And so your body, it's not a spike or surge of cortisol, but it's, instead of, all hormones want a burst and then to come down beautifully. But what we're having is, we're having the normal burst of cortisol, and then we're having the, oh my goodness, I'm late, oh, the breakfast is burnt, husband, children, work, traffic. And so we have a situation where we're running higher levels of cortisol. And so all of that pregnenolone, or not all, most of that pregnenolone is then shunted to produce cortisol, which means that there's less pregnenolone available to produce the other sex hormones. And so something that struck me a while back is that a lot of young girls, we live in a society that, you know, they're stressed from birth, from intrauterine even, and a lot of young girls are reaching their menarche having come from basically burnt out, basically having lived highly stressful lives. So I just wanted to highlight that the effect that stress has on our female hormones. So we need all of these hormones, so estrogen, progesterone, even testosterone, and all of them are balanced and should be available to give us a very smooth and even menstrual cycle, but many of us aren't experiencing that. I'll just stop there for a while, unless any...
Well, it's interesting because, you know, all these hormones, many of them have the same substrate. So if you're using the substrate to produce cortisol, the stress hormone, then you aren't using it to produce other hormones,
Exactly.
right? And so how does this relate to diet? Jackie, maybe you can talk about that. Like how, if we're in a state of heightened cortisol all the time, what does that mean in terms of our ability to respond to a low-carb diet?
Well, first of all, I think one of the reasons why people get addicted to carbs is that their blood sugar is constantly going up and then going down if they're on a high carbohydrate diet. And you're also then triggering an adrenal response when your blood sugar is dropping, as your body has to try to bring it back up. So the best diet, I think, for people to be on who are going through this up and down is a diet that is going to be low in carbs so that you're not getting the high increases in glucose followed by the rapid drops. And your brain doesn't like having lower fuel. It doesn't like a rapid change in blood sugar, and it's going to, and this is not when you're ketogenic. And it's going to tell your adrenals, you better do something about this. Produce more glucose to bring it back up. Now, the other concern of that is that having a lot of this adrenaline circulating around all the time gives you a lot of symptoms. You're overstimulated, you can have palpitations, you can have a rapid pulse rate, you may wake up in the middle of the night if your blood sugar is dropping and you can't get back to sleep. I mean, there's a whole host. Your moods are uneven, your energy is uneven, your brain isn't working well, you get irritable. So diet is very important when you have that kind of stress, regardless of what the triggers are, because it can be triggered for a lot of different reasons, but it's still the same biochemical reaction. And what you want to do is have a diet that is going to keep your blood sugar from going too high so it doesn't drop too low. One of the things I've noticed with the patients I saw at the Atkins Center is, you know, they come in, they're stressed with their job, they're stressed with the family, they have financial stress, their boss is a pain in the neck, and they are just so uptight, and then they go and they drink too much, or they're, you know, comfort eating, the potato chips, the whatever, and it's just getting worse. And a couple months after being on the diet, some people will walk in and say, you know what's really odd? I'm in the same situation I was before, but somehow I'm coping better. And so it's a major, major improvement when you take away the trigger, the dietary stress. And you can do that by keeping your blood sugar more stable. And your adrenals get a chance to recover instead of constantly having to call on adrenaline.
So is there a particular aspect to this that you think is specific to women? In other words, like all of us are dealing with this problem of high stress and the adrenal reaction, but is there a particular way in which that cortisol hormone robs the substrates from estrogen, progesterone, that makes it particularly hard for women?
I think it is. I think women have to have, I mean, every 28 days, you're supposed to be going through this nicely orchestrated cycle so that you ovulate in the middle of it, and then you either get pregnant or you don't, and then your uterus gets cleared out for the next cycle. And your estrogen and progesterones are changing during this cycle. Now, one of the things that I've read years and years ago is that American women have more PMS than any other culture. And I think one of the reasons is because, first of all, our diets are terrible. We have too much caffeine in our diet, or maybe alcohol or whatever, and stress is going to make all of that worse. So when you have stress like that, your body's going to have a very difficult time keeping those other hormones in the right ratio as you go through your monthly cycle. And you can get all this disruption. Women's periods often last 5 to 7 days. Normal is 3. You shouldn't be getting 5 to 7 days of bleeding. You shouldn't be getting all of this PMS. When you're stressed, you lose magnesium. Low magnesium means you may have a lot more menstrual cramps. You may be a lot more irritable. So it definitely is going to have an impact and interfere with this normal orchestrated flow that we're supposed to have of what happens to your hormones during your cycle.
So, and maybe that's also an issue, you know, there's tremendous issues of fertility in the country. You know, there's, I mean, hardly anybody here probably doesn't know somebody on fertility treatment, and maybe that also has to do with hormones and stress. And Maria, I think maybe you wanted to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, exactly what you're saying. When I was 16, I finally was diagnosed with PCOS, which is polycystic ovarian syndrome. Sadly, the doctor told me that was nothing I was doing. It was the cards I was dealt. It was my body basically failing me. It was that's just what the process was. Not liking that answer, looking into it deeper, what is causing that imbalance of hormones, that excess of male androgens, excess carbohydrates and caffeine. So guess what? I was working at a coffee shop at the time where I drank a lot of mochas, and I went home with the cinnamon rolls that didn't sell that day. So I had to really change my life, but I'm really happy that happened at a young age, because now people that I graduated with, they're coming to me like help, because they didn't have that wake-up call at that young age. I was glad that I changed those habits early, but it's a lot of carbohydrates that's causing this estrogen dominance and low progesterone, where you wake up in the middle of the night like, bing, I'm totally awake, and that's just causing more stress, more cortisol, and food is going to change that.
Does anybody else want to comment on that? This question of having imbalanced hormones and how food interacts with that?
I'll touch on alcohol. I mean, alcohol is a huge component of that estrogen dominance. You see that it's called a beer belly, but it's really an estrogen belly. And it decreases testosterone, which, like you mentioned earlier, women need some, and we want some, but alcohol is doing that. And when you get stressed, you mentioned that, you know, you go home and you have a couple drinks, and then you eat a lot of carbohydrates, which is going to cause that estrogen to also go up. So it's not just food, it's also, you know, the alcohol component and other places that we're seeking comfort rather than maybe getting outside and enjoying nature or something.
There's some new research also showing that when you introduce sugar, this is an animal study, but when you introduce sugar over a period of 7 days to a laboratory animal, the stress pathways in the brain start to activate. And this is a chemical reaction. So it's kind of an explanation for what Jack is talking about, where when you take those stress-inducing foods out of the system, suddenly the stressors that people ascribed to life go away. So that horrible boss becomes manageable, and the commute becomes a time to listen to music, and you can pay more attention to the children, and they're less aggravating, and you get better sleep, and then you're on an upward reinforcing spiral instead of more stress, worse relationships, more anger, on that downward spiral. Yep.
Did you want to say something, Jackie?
One of the things that I do with my clients is to teach them that food can't help you cope with stress. because the foods you're likely going to choose are the very foods that make you more biochemically stressed, because that's what you've learned to do all of your life. So most of my conversations with my patients, it's a few minutes about food, and the rest is about how to change habits, how to teach people have a more appropriate decision-making strategy about what am I going to eat. And one of the things is to really talk to them about and help them find other ways of coping with stress that are not related to food.
So, part of the stress that women have that men don't have is the stress to, we have much more stress to look good. I'm not sure there's a better way to put that, I'm sure. But, there's a lot more pressure on women, the sort of the glamour industry, this whole environment that is putting pressure on women in the way that it really doesn't for men. Joan, I know you've done a lot of work on this, so maybe you want to talk about that. I mean, how that really affects women differently, and what that means for your ability to eat healthfully.
Right. It's a really good question. Women do seem to be treated quite differently by the culture. Not only are they exposed to all the pressure around their bodies, but they're also just exposed to tremendously amount more to food cues. They're the ones who are more likely to be in the grocery store, in the kitchen. And then women also have the issue of more likely, not entirely, being the primary caregiver for children. And because of some of the issues that Jackie was talking about, children in our culture seem to be much more likely to have special needs. So that's extra pressure and stress on both parents, but I think primarily the mother. And mothers who choose to stay home with small children are isolated. And they're much more likely to turn to the most immediate source of comfort, which is processed foods in their homes. So on top of that, you have this cultural pressure to diet, and we have great research by Eric Stice showing that these diets, repeated diets, lead to binge eating. And this, you can trace that right back to primitive behavior, where if a primitive tribe maybe had to walk for 2 weeks to migrate to a food source, when they got there, the primitive survival behavior would be to binge. Whatever food was suddenly available there, they would eat as much as they could, as fast as they could, to competing with other animals, watching for predators, go sleep it off, come back, binge again until that food source was gone. So this could be a primitive response to dieting. Glamour industry is really been shown to promote eating disorders in children. I just for my talk Thursday saw some data showing that the time to start advising girls against dieting because it leads to binge eating is age 11. So very young girls are being preyed upon by the glamour industry. And then you have things like that women are at a higher risk of domestic violence. They're at a higher risk of being kind of trapped in a relationship that might be highly stressful. And what I've noticed in my practice, which is absolutely heartbreaking, is that women will be dependent on the approval of a man for spending the money on themselves to get recovery. So my program is $12 a week, and I have had women come and say, oh, my husband doesn't want to spend that money. Wow. Heartbreaking. So there are really particular things going on with women that are increasingly, as women's lib continues to progress, that you see more and more men experiencing these pressures, but there are very special pressures on women to overeat these numbing processed foods.
That's quite a story. Yes, go ahead. I think you have one to follow.
So I'm going to move a little bit away from that, but address that topic. So for me, and just bear with me for a little bit, I feel men and women alike, we suffer from, but probably women more, we suffer from a feeling of not being enough. And that can be societal, that can be cultural, and that is across the board, that it could be childhood, it's usually childhood, and then it's just reinforced. And that is why it's so important as parents, especially mothers, this is my personal belief, that the way we relate to the world, children learn from the way you model, not from what you say. And so if you walk into a store and you see somebody who makes you feel like that, your child is going to pick up on that. And your girl child is going to learn, or even your boy child is going to learn that we're not enough. And I've watched this, I've been so intrigued by this. If you watch little children of different race groups, in South Africa we're a multi-racial nation, and there's a certain point around 5.5-ish where a child, whichever race, boy or girl, is just buoyant and confident, and there comes a point when the child suddenly has a look in their face or in their eyes that they know that they're not enough. And how does this translate? For me, it's all about getting to the root cause. And if you're feeling that you're not enough, then you will put up with that spouse who says, I don't think we should do that. You will have wanted children desperately and then have the child and then feel like a victim. And so when you're having a bad day, instead of taking away from that day the gratitude and the position of power you're in to nurture a new life, your perspective is that, poor me, everything happens to me. I hope I'm getting my point across here, because to me that is the root cause of changing your thought process. What is the thought behind? For me, stress is, the bottom line is, what is the thought behind your stress? And of course there are certain things that are really stressful, like financial and domestic violence and things like that. But I believe it stems from, if you were brought up from a background where you were taught to believe that you're not enough, you can change that by doing a lot of emotional work. And if we, while we're doing the work, emulate the feeling of being enough and bring up the next generation, especially children. We're all talking about equality at the moment. I don't believe in equality, I don't believe in feminism, I believe in individuality. You know, men have certain powers and women have certain powers, and it's important to embrace your own individuality and your own personal set of difficulties that brought you into the world, which I believe are the glasses that we get to look at the world with a different perspective. So that's my belief in what the treatment of the high stress is.
So we have to change all of society.
One
everything. I think I want to dovetail off of that point into a conversation about something else, and I'm interested if this rings any bells with anybody in the room. But I think, and also this point about a woman feeling like her husband wouldn't support her, and in her desire to change her diet and pay more attention to herself. And so this is this is an issue that I think is maybe particular to women, and I have actually experienced this in my household, where my husband has really not been very supportive of eating a low-carb diet, and for a long time would bring home like loaves of bread. And I have one child who really struggles with his weight, and my husband would eat ice cream every night, and it was a really challenging issue for me, and now we are in a much better place on that. But I'm interested to hear from each of you if you have any tips and suggestions for our audience as to what do you do. I mean, women are often the ones who are doing most of the cooking at home and the shopping and the taking care of the kids. What do you do when you have a spouse who doesn't support it or is not in there with you? And let's start with Maria. Or partner, I should say.
This is something I do see quite a bit in clients, especially if it's a divorced family, where one spouse is, or the wife maybe is trying to change her diet, and then the kids will go to the father's house. I just say when they're with you, you just do what you can. But I ventured into this journey 8 years before my husband joined me. I did not want to be a nag. I have enough of those in my life that I didn't want to be one. And so I just led by example. And I do that, I think, with all of you. I don't judge you. Someone said, oh my gosh, you saw me have X in the elevator. I was like, I didn't even notice that. That's not my style. I'm not going to look in your cart. But that's just not what I do. But ultimately, it's you that has to change. But back to my point, just leading by example, eventually he was like, he wanted in on this. He saw my body not just transform inside, but outside. He saw my moods improve. I was much happier. And then eventually he's like, you don't have to buy that anymore. And then he stopped brewing his own beer and all of that. But I don't know if that really answered your question, but I just led by example, and I think all of us need to do that with other people, whether you're at work with them. You hear these stories all the time. Someone all of a sudden is transforming their life, and they're like, what did you do? And you're like, I cut out the bread, I cut out the rice, I cut out the pasta. Oh yeah, I can't do that. But eventually, you planted the seed in their mind, and maybe eventually they'll come to find that too.
There's one particular situation that I think is an important one to talk about, and that is, and I've seen it in my practice, and I'm not a psychotherapist and I don't want to do that, but you could at least have the recognition that this is going on, and that's when a woman is losing weight. And I had one couple, and I probably told this story in the past. I had one couple, the husband came in, he had some weight to lose, but not very much, and he was actually in very good health. His wife, however, wasn't. She had early cardiovascular disease, she had hypertension, she had type 2 diabetes. She was overweight, she was maybe 45 pounds overweight. And so they both went on the plan together, and of course, what would happen is he would be cheating a lot and come in and he'd lose twice as much weight that she did. And he would rub it in. He was very nasty about it. He would make fun of her that I did so much better. And I had to try to figure out how to cope with this and how to deal with it. And it went on, and she started doing much better. Blood sugars were better. She lost weight. We learned to ignore him temporarily while he was in the visits. And then Valentine's Day came along. Now, this lady was at risk for a heart attack, and so this wasn't just, she was unhappy about the way she looked. There were some serious issues here. And she comes in, and she was clearly upset, and so, I asked her, what was going on, and she said, well, do you know what my husband bought me for Valentine's Day? A big box of chocolates. Yeah. Well, I asked him to leave the room and told him I wanted to talk with him separately, but I wanted to talk with his wife first. So we dealt with that. And then I talked to him and told him I would never see the two of them together again. And I really needed him to be respectful. I needed him to be helpful. And what was going on, that this was so difficult for him to accept. And he never really admitted anything to me, but I saw it before, that sometimes if the woman starts looking better and feeling better and is perhaps more assertive, more confident now because she's looking better, he's afraid she's going to get up and leave. And yet they can't admit that necessarily to themselves. But it needs to be addressed, or else this marriage could have some difficulties, or else this poor woman could have reverted back to the way she was eating in order to not have to deal with his behavior, and she could very well have had a heart attack. So I recommended them for counseling, because I really thought that there were underlying issues that had to be looked at, that here she was getting better and he would bring her very worst possible thing on Valentine's Day. So there is that dynamic that does go on,
Yeah,
and can be a difficult one.
Well, it's just so interesting because I think that it's just definitely true that if you lose 30, 40 pounds, and you feel transformed, and for many women, I think myself included, it was like the first time that I had ever really looked good in clothes, and I was in my 40s. And so all of a sudden, new horizons open, and it can really change the dynamic in a relationship. So I see, Joan, you're also nodding there. I don't know if you want to add something to that.
Well, I think this is a discussion where the addiction model really helps, because when you can say, oh, there are substances here. Now, what would we do if this were tobacco? And I come home and I say, I'm going to quit smoking. And, my spouse starts lighting up and puffing smoke in my direction. Or alcoholism, where I'm quitting drinking, but a couple of nights later, this nice bottle of alcohol appears in the home. So once you say, oh, this is an addiction, then you can bring in all the addiction recovery experience. And one of the things that people say to me all the time, why do you offer 4 hours a day to your members? And it's because they're having these kinds of problems that Jackie's describing moment to moment. And if you can catch them and get them talked through often enough during the day, they don't build up to a binge at night. They don't build up to a binge in the middle of the afternoon. So, and there's a lot of this to do. It's very confusing, when a woman has recovery finally. She might be 60 years old, and she's been struggling with this all of her life, but finally she comes in, she's got the addiction model, she's got enough support, and she begins to make progress. Well, there's an entire system around her of relationships that are formed, kind of predicated on, structured on her weight, her binging, her depression. There's a whole constellation of relationships that are going to shift. Her children, her spouse, her boss, her friends, her extended family, they are all some of them are going to really start to actively sabotage her. They liked the old addict, they liked binging with her, and they're mad about this. And of course, because they're all experts, they're going to start piling on the advice about why this could possibly never work, and she really needs to. I had a story the other day of a woman who went to a social event where family members were present, and she was, I'm not having that, I'm not having that, I'm not having that. And finally a family member came over and said, you're insulting the honoree by not eating that. And if you're just so self-centered and you're so So the pressures that people who are working what I call clean food plan are incredible. So what do you do? Let's talk about children just really briefly first. What do you do about children? You get their guts cleaned out.
You get their what?
You get their guts cleaned out. So how do you do that? It takes 4 days to repopulate a gut. Why is that so interesting? Because the microorganisms that are there to break down the toxic foods die off. They're not being fed. It's part of withdrawal, that 4-day keto flu. The liver stops stocking the enzymes to break down those foods. So the child will actually go through withdrawal. It's very tragic. When you think about children food addicts or baby food addicts, it's very hard to think about that, but they do. And if the parent can really hang in there and get that child through the 4-day withdrawal, then that child will pop out. There'll be all the things that we experience, they will experience. They'll be more energetic, nicer to be with, and less sick, less difficult to manage. So the cool thing is that when that child tries to eat that food again, they'll be immediately sick. So the stuff he knows and the immediate drowsiness and irritability and maybe a stomach ache, but hopefully a headache, is a deterrent. So you don't want to get into enabling. You don't want to get into an Al-Anon. You don't want to get into codependency. You don't never, ever, ever fight anybody about food. Just manipulate the heck out of the environment. Like, have the smell of really great food in the house all the time. Get that slow cooker going and have that smell. Smell cues are incredibly important. Keep clean food out on the counter. My therapist said that when I got sober off of sugars and flours 23 years ago, she said, you're allowed 4 rules. The kids, they don't have a choice. I am their mother. I'm in charge of protecting them. So they may not bring processed foods in the house. They may not eat it in front of me. I'm not going to get it, and I'm not going to pay for it. They have their own allowance. They can go to school and get it at school. And that cleared a lot of queuing out of the house. But what really helped, because they continued to buy the bad foods at school, what really helped is we took a 10-day spring break vacation. We started in January. Over that 10 days, their guts totally repopulated. And the liver was not prepared to break down those foods anymore. So when they got back to school and they tried to buy that stuff, they just immediately passed out. They're in trouble for falling asleep at their desk. They couldn't think that severe brain fog. Nobody wanted to be around them because they were so irritable. And they had a headache. So they developed what I call natural aversion.
Wow, that's completely fascinating. I will say in the case of my child who had a pretty serious food addiction that I had the privilege of, the difficulty of the dynamic between a mom and a child when you're trying to get them to eat a certain way, especially say when they're a teenager, is not easy. And I was lucky enough to get him an outside doctor, and that doctor person was sort of the authority. It was like, well, what does the doctor say? And let's just follow what the doctor says. So it took it out of our own mother-son dynamic, and that was really helpful to have somebody to blame. I want to ask you all the question that had originally interested me when I thought about doing this kind of panel, and then I want to open it up for questions. I'm going to leave some time for that. But and it's a shift from what we've been talking about, is the low-carb, do women need to do the low-carb diet differently than men? And this is a question that I was asking everybody when I was on a low-carb diet and I wasn't losing weight, and I talked to various women in the field, and one of them said, women need to carb cycle more than men, or women need to eat more carbs than men do. So there were a number of answers to that, and I'm just wondering what each of you would say to that question, because we are obviously different.
Before I answer that question, can I just add something to the last question,
Yeah.
which I think is vital with children as well as with the adult. The first thing is that you can only help yourself. And so in medical school, we learn see one, do one, teach one. And so initially, when you're confronted with a low-carbohydrate diet, it's brand new, and you go through a period of adjustment. And after that period of adjustment and empowering yourself with knowledge and doing, then it's very important to teach, because when you teach, then you understand, then you really know what you understand. And so I'm big on empowerment. I've got 2 kids, 4 and 7, from as early as they could remember. As they could, I've had them in the kitchen, chopping vegetables and mixing and things like that. And for me, the best thing is educate children as early as possible. So now when I'm not looking and my son's had a banana and he's going for an apple, we don't eat much fruit, but my daughter says, there's 7 teaspoons of sugar, you're going to have another 5 more, you're not allowed. And, and I don't want to be the mom who poisons their mind against sugar, and so I teach them about the immune system. And like soldiers, your soldiers are getting really sleepy, and the bugs are going to get in there. And do you want those soldiers to be sleepy, or do you want fresh? And do you want the soldiers that are going to shoot bullets and nets and capture those And so that's how I teach them. If they don't like liver, I'll say, you know, oh wow, there's vitamin A, do you know what that does? And, you know, and we'll play games around it. And I'm often asked, how do your children eat all those whole foods? And it's about never giving up, but giving choice and offering the foods that they do eat, whole foods like avocado and egg and raw vegetables, things that they can pick and feel empowered to choose rather than just having one option on the plate, and then add that little bit of new food on the side. And even if they just take a little lick, that's a win. The next time it's a tiny bite, that's a win. And then, you know, that's my personal experience. And then back to your question, I believe in bio-individuality. But, you know, obviously we have hormones, and we know that at certain times of your cycle, your needs for carbs might increase. But I think that it's really personal. I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all in my personal experience. We know that, and I see in my practice, that a lot of women don't tolerate dairy. I try to get all my patients off dairy anyway, because a cow produces milk for a calf to become a big cow. And so in terms of animal milk, a goat is more our size. So, you know, but again, it's individuality. It depends how much you react to that type of food.
So from an addiction perspective, these are addictive, harmful substances, and men benefit from getting off of them just as much as women.
I think there's clearly a difference in the way women lose weight as compared to men. Men certainly have more lean mass than women generally do, and that means their metabolic rates are going to be different. Women do go through so many hormone changes, and when those hormones aren't changing the way they were designed to, that can have metabolic effects. Women can tend to run into hypothyroidism as they go through perimenopause and would need some assistance there. I think the biggest thing is that if you're feeling better on your program, and even if your weight loss is slower because you're a female, it's still a victory for you to continue that program. Because as you get older, women tend to get postmenopausal breast cancer more. You're at higher risk for heart disease, even though women can have a heart attack before menopause. Your body is changing. You redistribute body fat, even though your weight may not change. And that can all be frustrating. But I like to talk to my patients who are perhaps having more difficulty now than they did earlier in their lives, losing weight, is that this is an investment in your future health and your quality of life. And that, for me, I hope that is motivating enough for them to just be patient. But I do think men can eat more than women can. Our bodies are different. I don't agree with a lot of the patients that I've had telling a woman to increase her carbs at a certain time, because I've seen women not be able to get back off. It can be a struggle then. It can be days or weeks as we're trying to get them back on track, because they've triggered the reward centers in the brain, and they've gotten themselves re-addicted. So I'm not a big fan of that. I'm also not a big fan of you can have a cheat day once a week. That metabolically to me makes no logical sense whatsoever. And so you are an individual, and this is the only body you have, so what you have to do is nurture it the way it's working. And over time, as I said previously in my other talk, you will start to make progress. You just need to stop comparing yourself to the way you were when you were younger, and also to your husband, because he's going to do better than you do, most likely.
There are essential fatty acids. There are essential amino acids. There are no essential carbohydrates. The proof is in the pudding with, results in my children. They like to eat carnivore. There are plenty of women that get pregnant on a carnivore diet. They're not adding in carbohydrates. I do think that women fail to eat enough protein, that they're afraid of that. Cholesterol makes healthy hormones. Carbohydrates do not. So that's something that I fight with all the time, with that controversy of carb ups. But the thyroid needs a lot of amino acids from protein. A lot of women complain about losing their hair. It's usually because their fat macros are higher than their protein ones, and they just need to not fear those. But I liked how you mentioned the whole addiction thing with the carbohydrates. It's a slippery slope. It really, really is. I see some people get triggered off the most simplest of food, just their sugar reward system is triggered. So I think it's a slippery slope.
Interesting. Okay, so I won't do the carb cycling, like. Definitely not.
There's no judging in my world. I'm just saying.
Are there any questions from the audience? Do folks want to line up and ask some questions? We have 7 or 8 more minutes. We have time for like 3 or 4 questions. Go ahead.
Hello, lovely ladies. I was hoping you could share your best clinical pearls, tips, and tricks for our female patients that have autoimmunity, like Hashimoto's and like lipidemia.
So obviously clean up the diet as much as possible, but again, realize that, well, in my practice, I take it really slowly and give the patient a lot of autonomy. Because for a lot of patients, this has been a chronic illness. There's a lot of victim mentality associated with it at times, a lot of anger and resentment. And so I like to work on the circadian rhythm. I like to balance the environment for the patient, or allow the patient to balance their environment. So things that they can do easily, like when to stop eating, getting the right environment for deep sleep, managing stress, choosing a form of exercise that's empowering and makes them feel good. And then eventually, so it becomes a long-term journey, and then eventually, so mentioning depending which type of patient I'm getting, mentioning the diet that we're going to be looking at their vitamin D and omega-3, and all the other nutritional factors, but planning, giving a wide scope, almost like an a la carte menu, and allowing the patient to choose from that and working through it step by step.
All of that, plus to really focus on the role of stress in immune dysfunction. One of the biggest stressors in our culture is loneliness. So this may not seem like a connection, but get them into a group. Like, that's one of the reasons I keep talking about these online groups, is that it solves a lot of stress-related problems.
Chronic stress is going to depress the immune system. So one of the things to do is to really build up the immune system with, of course, a proper diet. Magnesium is excreted at higher levels when you're chronically stressed, and at least in the United States, most of us are magnesium deficient anyway. So sometimes supplementing with magnesium is helpful. B-complex sometimes helps too, especially if the person is tired, because you also use up a lot of B-complex when you're chronically stressed also. And anything that's going to take the load off of the immune system, which is relaxation, sleep, of course a low-carb diet so that you're not getting the ups and downs of blood sugar, but also fun time to yourself. And of course women have that as an issue. Women are used to being to nurturing. That's one of their jobs. And oftentimes they don't have the energy left to nurture themselves. They spend so much time taking care of other people. And so having time to yourself, to do something you enjoy, maybe to meet with friends, whatever, something like that that's for you, that gets you out of your normal routine is also important. And the other issue as far as diet, if there's like a Hashimoto's, which is an autoimmune thyroiditis, is to take a look at food sensitivities. And of course, one of the things that we would look at is get people off of dairy, and sometimes other foods too, that may make immune function weaker. And so that's just one of the other things we did.
I 3 minutes, so go for it.
I'm aware of the connection between insulin resistance and PCOS. I also understand the connection between estrogen dominance and carbohydrate consumption. And after my own what felt like miraculous healing from symptoms of severe endometriosis, I did a lot of research on the research that was out there about that, and I didn't find much about endometriosis and metabolic syndrome. I know there's a lot on PCOS, so I wondered if any of you could comment about endometriosis specifically.
That's for Maria. Yeah.
Do you have fibroids?
No.
Eating this way will obviously help. Dealing with clients with that, there were certain supplements that I have them on, which if you're interested in, I can let you know afterwards. But,
Sure.
yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Anybody else? Next.
For the sake of time, just please put this panel together and go visit the schools and sit in front of groups of girls who are 11 to 17 and start this empowerment earlier. This is great stuff.
Thank you. Do we have time for one more question?
So my question was also about endometriosis. There's not a lot of research or papers on that. So do you have any experience with your patients or customers, clients?
We did see some women with endometriosis, and we would use the same protocol we used for PCOS. But I will say it is much harder to deal with, and oftentimes women had surgeries to have to clean out the endometrial lining that was outside the body. I don't have anything more positive to say about that. It is a tough one to deal with.